2 weeks ago in the history video, we discussed the origin of the Vietnam War, the obliteration of the Eisenhower policy of massive retaliation if Russia screwed with us, but avoiding brushfire conflicts with American ground troops and a large military budget. And the Kennedy administration, when it took office in a very macho way, was determined to get involved all over the world, pay any price, meet any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. That's a quote from his first inaugural. And that led to a policy that damn near blew up the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis and in the Berlin Crisis, and led to the beginning of our involvement in Vietnam. Now, there's some very convincing evidence that Kennedy had decided not to commit to war in Vietnam and was beginning to withdraw American advisors when he was killed. Johnson pretended that he was not going to send, quote, American boys to fight a war Asian boys ought to be fighting. And he ran in 1964 as the peace candidate against the Republican nominee, Senator Barry Goldwater. And in fact, Johnson's most famous advertisement, really the first negative TV ad in American history, quite a distinction, was a little girl pulling petals off a daisy, and then a countdown as she pulls it, and an atomic bomb goes off, and you see the mushroom cloud, and then you hear Johnson saying, "Those are the stakes. Either we must learn to live together, or surely we will perish." But as soon as the election was over, Johnson implemented the plans he'd had all along for a massive escalation of the war in Vietnam. And the history is well known. He fabricated an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's not clear whether it was entirely fabricated or simply blown out of proportion by Johnson, but he made it like Vietnam had attacked the American Navy, and he got a more or less blanket congressional resolution for any military action he wanted. And using that resolution, he escalated a gigantic war in Vietnam that lasted for 8 or 10 years, involved 58,000 American dead, and accomplished absolutely nothing. We lost eventually because Vietnam went communist. And the prediction, which was that this would be like the first domino, and if Vietnam fell, Laos and Cambodia would fall, which they did. They're basically part of Vietnam. But then Thailand would fall, and Burma would fall, and Malaysia would fall, and Singapore, and the Philippines, and sooner or later we'd have to hunker down in San Francisco and defend the West Coast. Absolutely ridiculous. Never happened, could never happen, and no justification at all for the war. But viewed from the hindsight of history, there were two crucial elements that the Vietnam War triggered in the American political psyche. The first was an absolute decision not to ever incur large military casualties again. The United States lost, as you probably know, 400,000 or 500,000 men in the Civil War, about 150,000 in World War I, about 250,000 in World War II, 48,000 in Korea, and 58,000 in Vietnam. And that was it. Those days were over as soon as Vietnam ended. Never again would the American people tolerate a massive military commitment with tens and tens of thousands of combat deaths. You see how restive they were about the war in Iraq and are about the war in Afghanistan, even though the deaths in Afghanistan have yet to hit the 3,000 mark, and in Iraq I think there were just slightly more than 3,000 American combat deaths. Imagine what would happen if there were 58,000 dead in any of those conflicts. And the harm that was done, the drug addiction, the broken lives, the destroyed families, was just awful as a result of the Vietnam War. And unfortunately, the soldiers did not receive any support from the American people and were derided when they came home, very, very unfairly and very unfortunately, because they were real heroes who were trying to fight for freedom and democracy. But it was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it led to a permanent decision by the Pentagon and by the American presidents never again to risk this kind of large combat casualties. But the second effect of the Vietnam War was even more important. It marked the end of the gullible and credulous attitude of the American people toward their government. Until Vietnam, we basically believed that our government always told us the truth. And we basically believed that if there were secrets, it was important that the secrets be kept from us because we trusted the government to know better. But Johnson and Nixon continuously lied to us about the Vietnam War. Johnson first pretended he was not in favor of the war, got elected on a peace platform, and then entered the war. He pretended the Gulf of Tonkin was a huge deal, which it wasn't. And each time he would send another 100,000 American soldiers to Vietnam, he would say, this is it, this is the last escalation, this will solve the problem, until eventually over 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. And then Nixon took it one step further. He secretly invaded Cambodia, right next to Vietnam, bombed it and invaded it, and denied that he was doing it. And there was a whole range of black ops going on in Vietnam that the administration itself denied, sold the American people that it was telling the truth, and then it turned out they were lying through their teeth. And that really was the last time we completely trusted our government. The demarcation of the Vietnam War in terms of the credibility of the government came home to me once when President Clinton told me in the White House that a reporter had asked him on President's Day in 1995 if he could ask his idol, John Kennedy, one question, what would it be? And he said that he answered, what was it like to be president at a time when Americans felt their government usually told them the truth? Fascinating concept. Thanks a lot.